New York's 12th district is important and notable for at least a couple of reasons. Politically, very interesting that it is in fact Donald Trump's home district, but also it's represented by a Democrat, incumbent Carolyn Maloney, who's held that seat for almost 3 decades. Interesting mishmash there. One other important fact about this district is that it faces a new primary challenger on the Democratic side. That is Pete Harrison, who joins us now on the Damage Report. Pete, welcome to the show.
Hey, John. How's it going? Glad to be back on the show.
Glad to have you here and to talk about the candidacy. So, look, as I pointed out in the intro, this is a pretty fascinating district. Real estate is obviously a big part of this. I mean, it's got Donald Trump living there, but also the incumbent has raised quite a bit of money from real estate interests in the area. So, tell me a little bit more about this campaign and how it's going.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll start right there that, Representative Maloney, as you mentioned, has been there for a very long time. And over those 26 years, she has taken a considerable amount of money from Wall Street and from real estate, notably including Donald Trump himself. She has backed the Amazon headquarters deal that was also part of the district in Long Island City, which at the end of it was just a real estate land grab. And finally, she is also a landlord. So, in a district that is over 70% renters, it's hard to see her as part of the solution because I think, frankly, she's part of the problem.
That's very interesting. Let's talk about that then. You say that she's not a part of the solution. She is a landlord. You, on the other hand, have a progressive housing plan. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think to start with, the two things that I often talk about with the affordable housing crisis are, first, it is not a local issue. Sorry, I got a phone call.
That's okay.
It is not a local issue. It is an issue that impacts virtually every part of the country. It looks differently in New York City and LA than it does in other rural parts of the country, but it's still the same housing insecurity that working class home renters and homeowners have to deal with. And the second thing is that the crisis is not just going to end on itself, because at the end of the day, it's not really a crisis about housing. It's a crisis about capitalism. The bottom line is that there's a ton of money to be made off of the housing crisis, whether it's big real estate developers like Related, corporate landlords like Blackstone, where I live, or extremist billionaires like Donald Trump. There's a ton of money to be made from housing insecurity, and they throw enough of that towards politicians at all levels to keep the status quo in place. So I think the solution to both of those problems are a national solution that talks about housing outside of the market. So that is why I'm really excited to be a part of and now running on the Homes Guarantee, because the Homes Guarantee does just that, and it's partly because it was written by impacted communities. So it tackles the really core issues of the housing crisis. And the first is economic inequality. We're going to build 12 million homes outside of the housing market so that it will be deeply affordable and permanently affordable. It deals with racial injustice, from redlining to gentrification today. The real estate market has been deeply racist. So the Homes Guarantee talks about ending racist bank lending. It talks about ending racist zoning. And it actually is going to give reparations for communities of color, particularly, that have been displaced because of the housing crisis. And I think finally, the Homes Guarantee is actually, I think, a central part of this bigger transition into a Green New Deal economy that's making our cities and our towns more sustainable and resilient by building green housing, by investing in free public transportation and all these other resiliency measures. So it's a really, really exciting platform to be running on. And I'm hoping that, at least with parts of my efforts and others, that it's going to be up there with Medicare for All and the Green New Deal as part of the conversation this election cycle.
I love the way that you explain the connection between the Green New Deal and your housing plan there, because I know some right-wingers say, well, why is everything in the Green New Deal? They're almost going out of their way to not understand the connections between these seemingly on the surface disparate areas of policy. But as you point out, there is a big link there. And I think we really live in an interesting time now, because as you just explained, the history of discrimination in housing, inequality in access to housing, it's particularly bad in LA and New York now, but this goes back decades and decades and decades. And yet now I feel like you hear a lot more national talk about it. I mean, Bernie Sanders has his plan, AOC at the big rally just a week or two ago. She talked quite a bit about access to housing. And so I think that you've really hit on an important time to focus on this in your candidacy. It's something that I think a lot of people are really thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always been seen as this fundamentally local issue that the federal government doesn't have a role to play in it. And the inverse is true, that the federal government has created the grounds for this crisis. I was at the rally last week. It's actually in my district. And it was notable because it was across the street from Queensbridge Houses, which is the largest publicly owned development in the country. And that wasn't a coincidence. It's a fundamental part of AOC's housing plan, Bernie Sanders' housing plan, which I had the benefit of working on a little bit. It is about building sustainable housing outside of the speculative market. It's empowering local communities. It's empowering folks that are ultimately better at fighting for their homes and their communities than anybody else is. So I think centering housing as this bigger progressive agenda is a really winning strategy. And I think I mentioned this the previous time that I was on the show with you, but had home renters voted at the same percentage as home owners in 2016, Hillary Clinton would have won in a landslide. So this really is the Obama coalition that Democrats have not really been able to put back together. And I think having a really strong housing agenda, particularly centering renters, is that sort of missing link to rally the base.
As you're describing it, I know that you're right, and it's interesting because that's the sort of issue that is so off the front of the mind of most mainstream political commentators. It's not something they talk about. They would never think about the distinction. I mean, I've heard a lot of this sort of voter goes this way, this goes the other way, but I've never thought about it, even myself as a renter, about the distinction between renters and homeowners. So very fascinating insight there. Pete Harrison, congressional candidate for the 12th district. Thank you once again for joining us, and just continuing good luck in your candidacy.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.